Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we find out how the RAF plans to achieve net zero by 2040. We'll also reheat a few stories, just in case you missed them. But first, see if you can identify this noise. Find out if you're right at the end of this episode. Now, the RAF plans to achieve net zero by 2040, but for a military service that flies jets, that presents an incredible challenge. As COP26 concluded last year, we sent our correspondent Flight Lieutenant Ben to find out what those plans look like.
We are looking at synthetic and sustainable aviation fuels. They are slightly different because of where they're generated from. The fuel that we've just flown the little microlight on was made from hydrogen, carbon dioxide sucked out of the air. We have tens of thousands of diesel vehicles and noisy aeroplanes. Hello, I'm Group Captain Maurice Dixon. My role is DACOS Sustainability. I'm based at High Wycombe, but I do a lot of work here at RAF Leeming. And my role is to put together the RAF's Net Zero 2040 strategy and then turn it into reality via an implementation plan.
So the environment's very, very topical at the minute. COP26 was a huge conference that happened very, very recently, and aviation is a big part of the RAF's impact on climate. What is the Air Force doing to address that?
As you said, COP26 is just finished. It's an indication of how serious the world has got to take climate change into account. And it is a huge challenge, not only for the world but for all militaries. You know, as you've said, we use a lot of fossil fuels, and ultimately to help reduce the impact of COP26, we have to find a way of operating not only the military but all our lives beyond fossil fuels, and that's really what the sustainability and net zero climate adaptation strategy is all about. Is understanding how the military can operate beyond fossil fuels. We have set ourselves an ambitious target of getting as close to net zero as possible by 2040, and that is 10 years ahead of the government target. But we feel that if we don't set ourselves that stretch target, then we won't be able to accelerate some of the technologies that we need, and we might actually lose out on some of the advantages. So if other countries move ahead of us, then they will take an operational advantage if we don't move faster.
You had mentioned there, obviously, that fossil fuels forms a huge amount of the total fuel and energy that we use. Do you have any figures around how much we use in terms of the percentages for our aircraft or support or anything like that?
Yeah, so from the government perspective, the MOD, from a central government perspective, is about 50% of the government's carbon footprint. So we are a big part of the problem, and therefore we have to become a big part of the solution. And from the MOD's perspective, the RAF has the biggest carbon footprint, about 42%, which is roughly about 2 million tonnes of CO2. And then within the RAF's carbon footprint, the RAF estate and land fuels is about 25%. But our biggest challenge is 75%, which is aviation fuels that we use. So that is really where we have to focus a lot of our effort.
The RAF is the biggest player in this field in terms of the MOD, therefore it's important that we lead the effort almost. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, but specifically from the aviation perspective, we will lead military aviation. The Army and the Navy have their own challenges. So the Army's biggest carbon footprint is the estate. They have the biggest part of the MOD estate. I'm not sure of the percentages, but their biggest challenge is the estate. And the Navy is similar to us. Their operational fuels from their ships is bigger than their estate. So from aviation perspective, yes, we will lead on military aviation, and not only ourselves but in collaboration with other militaries, which we're now setting up collaboration arrangements with.
Is this just a top level strategy in terms of by 2040 we want to be carbon neutral, or is it bigger than that? Is it a whole force effort that is required to make sure we do that? Because like you said, it is ambitious. It's faster than what the government are expecting to achieve their targets in.
Yes, so the strategy has three themes. One is carbon net zero business as usual by 2025. So how do we change people's attitudes, behaviours? How do we make the right decisions and embed net zero targets in everything that we do, from setting requirements to procurement? Second theme is net zero estate. So how do we get the estate to net zero by 2030? And then ideally negative, so we're sort of building carbon credit in the bank to then offset the aviation piece, which is net zero by 40. But we know even by 2040, 2050, we will be emitting carbon because of the aviation fuels, just the way they are so energy dense. You know, we're not going to be flying aircraft on new fuels, although the future fuels will be less carbon intensive, such as synthetic sustainable aviation fuels that we're looking at. So we will always have a residual emission output that we then have to offset from the estate side. So that's the overall sort of three-theme strategy. But as you say, it's a whole force approach. So it's the military personnel, it's our civil service colleagues, it's our contractors, and it's all the way down the defence supply chain. So at the moment, when you measure carbon, there are sort of three scopes that you measure. One is the energy you buy in, one is the emissions that you generate from using the energy, and the third one is your sort of wider supply chain, down the supply chain. So at the moment, we're focusing on scope 1 and 2, which is how much energy we consume and use ourselves, but we're very focused on working with industry in how we procure future equipment, so that when we procure new equipment, we minimise the carbon footprint of the production and use of that new stuff. So the next phase, we'll be working with industry to understand how they can help us reduce our carbon footprint as well.
You talked a little bit there about aviation fuels, and the future is synthetic fuel, and that will still have some carbon footprint. There are also electric aircraft that are being trialled at the minute. I think Rolls-Royce have just done some test flights with them. Is that something that could be looked at as well, or will that not work, and is there a reason for that?
No, absolutely. So we are looking at synthetic and sustainable aviation fuels. They are slightly different because of where they're generated from. So we have, last week, you might have heard in the news, we did our first Guinness World Record 100% synthetic fuel flight with a small aircraft. So we're really keen on understanding how synthetic fuels will help us in the future. Sustainable aviation fuels also have a massive footprint. They're roughly both about 80 to 90% carbon reduction from emissions when you're using them. So we're really looking at how sustainable aviation fuels can be used as a drop-in replacement for normal jet fuel, so that we can start using standard fuels that have a smaller carbon footprint. And so we're looking at doing 100% sustainable aviation fuel flight tests in the next few months to really understand how we get from the 50-50 blend that we're allowed to use anyway to that 100% blend piece if we have to for whatever reason. And then, as you've mentioned, electric and hydrogen is also a potential future aviation opportunity. So we've already set in train Project Telum, which is the first electric aircraft to replace the Grob tutor that we use for basic training. We've said that's going to be zero emissions, so it could be electric, it could be a combination of electric and hydrogen, but they obviously bring their own challenges in an aviation environment, and so we are sort of de-risking the technology at the moment, so we really understand, one, is it a true replacement? And then secondly, what are the whole force challenges of moving from normal aviation fuels to electric or hydrogen fuels in the future, or ammonia even. So that's all part of a sort of de-risking exercise. But we're definitely looking at how do we, where it's appropriate, move beyond liquid hydrocarbon fuels, and training aircraft seems an obvious one to look at for electric.
So you've mentioned synthetic aviation fuel there. Can you just tell us what that actually is?
Yeah, so synthetic fuels are purely man-made. So the fuel that we've just flown the little microlight on was made from hydrogen, carbon dioxide sucked out of the air, and in fact actually used on a little aircraft that's just taken off, similar to that one, so the Grob Prefect and the Grob Tutor. That's the sort of aircraft that you could use synthetic aviation fuels in. And sustainable aviation fuels tend to come from more natural products such as waste or biomass. So there is a subtle difference, and one sort of a subset of the other, if you like. You know, for any fuel to be sustainable, it's got to come from a low carbon footprint, but actually it's got to have an enduring ability to manufacture it as well. So we're really interested in how you manufacture the fuel, so you don't get yourself down a bit of a rabbit hole, and then in 10 years' time, you can't produce the fuel anymore, because the feedstock that you've been using for the last 10 years is either not available or it's been redirected somewhere else.
Well, that's what I was just going to ask you about. So obviously you've said that you're aiming for 2040 to have the aircraft running on more sustainable fuel, and the current blend, the 50-50 blend that you mentioned, obviously that fuel is available in some form now, but is it widely enough available at the minute to make this happen, or is the technology just not quite there yet?
No, the sustainable aviation fuel that is available is there's not a lot of it produced globally. One, because there's not a lot of demand because it's quite expensive, and it's quite expensive because there's not a lot of demand. So it's a bit of a cyclic circle at the moment. So we are working with the Department for Transport and the UK Jet Zero Council to understand how we can inject the investment that's required, not only in the UK but globally, to start producing more SAF, so that it can be taken up in a greater percentage by all airlines and all air forces and you know all aviation users, and we're really in sort of the really early stages of that. But if the aviation sector globally is to reduce its carbon footprint, then developing the production facilities for more SAF has got to be a priority. But it's expensive, to invest in new SAF refineries, etc. The other challenge is there is no global standard at the moment for a standard sustainable or synthetic aviation fuel, so we have to work with the standards authorities to actually develop those standards so that anybody who produces SAF, we know that it's a 100% drop-in replacement for current aviation fuels, and that will take a few years.
And you'd also mentioned that we want to be using this to fly aircraft on for the future, for the foreseeable. That's where we're moving to. Are our aircraft capable at the minute of all flying that, or is there a bigger infrastructure piece that needs to happen within the Air Force? Most
aircraft globally now, if they're flying with normal Jet A or what we call Defence Standard 91091, which is sort of the military standard, they can fly up to 50-50 blend without any problems. It's getting beyond that 50-50 blend. Most airlines and air forces don't fly with SAF at the moment, although we have started to put SAF into some of our flights. So again, we had some synthetic sustainable aviation fuel went into the Voyager Vespina VIP aircraft a few weeks ago, which took on a VIP flight into the Middle East. So we are now starting to be asked to put synthetic aviation fuel into aircraft, but from a safety perspective, we're sort of keeping it separate until we really understand how it can mix and how it can't be mixed. So whenever SAF goes into an aircraft of whatever mix, it will be kept separate from the normal fuel supply chain, and then hopefully in a year or two time it will start coming through the pipeline anyway in greater sort of ratios of mix as part of the government's mandate to start using more SAF in general aviation fuel infrastructure.
So if we were to put 100% synthetic aviation fuel in an aircraft, would it fly?
Yes, and so we're hoping to do one of those flights early next year. The main reason for that is to understand the engineering and sort of the safety case issues of how we want to get from 50-50 blend to 100%. So as I said, there is no SAF standard at the moment, and there is also no way of accrediting an aircraft to fly with passengers, etc., on 100%. So it's understanding that gap that we need to start developing over the next few years to get 100% SAF globally agreed, and also how do we certify our aircraft on 100% SAF, because there are some potential engineering challenges, which is the reason why we've only gone to 50-50 blend at the moment.
There's also quite a lot going on in the infrastructure front as well. The stations are doing a lot of different things to try and reduce their carbon footprint as well. Can you just talk to me about some of the headline things that some of the stations are doing to reduce the carbon footprint?
Yep, so we're looking at all the normal, what we call sort of no regrets issues. So how can we change people's behaviours so they're more energy efficient? Turn the lights off when you leave the building, turn your IT off. So the first thing is to reduce the demand. We're also looking at the building infrastructure. A lot of the MOD and sort of government infrastructure is not particularly energy efficient, so they leak a lot of heat and energy. So here at RAF Leeming, we've just done a survey of 3 different types of single living accommodation, so a T block, an H block and a slam block, and then we're hoping to do some retrofits to each of those ones to see what's the best thermally efficient retrofit that we can apply, so we can reduce, again, the biggest challenge we have on the estate is gas, the use of gas for heating and hot water. So how can we reduce the gas consumption, also electrical consumption? So how can we put in standard things like LEDs when we replace a light, put in energy efficient equipment, and have almost like smart buildings that will reduce the energy when there's nobody in the building, and then learn the pattern of the use of the building. So maybe half an hour before the building's used in the morning, it'll start heating everything up, and then it knows that everybody leaves at 7 o'clock, so it'll reduce. So if we can take the human out of the loop, again, that will help. Because we are very fallible, when we're not paying the bill, we tend to ignore the energy costs. But you and I are probably energy efficient at home, because you have to pay the bill from your own wallet. But when you come to work, it's slightly different. So if we can take the human out of the loop with smart buildings, then that's one of the things we're trying to do at Leeming here as well, is to turn a couple of buildings into smart buildings with sensors, low efficient lighting, and also a lot of sub-metering. So we know how much energy we use at RAF Leeming. We don't particularly know in the sort of greater fidelity which buildings are using how much energy and how much we're wasting. So we're planning to put in a lot of sub-meters so we can really understand where that energy is being used, and then we can target where the energy is being wasted in an appropriate way.
And is that a test case that's just happening at Leeming, or is that something that is being looked at across the wider Air Force, or is it something that needs to happen across the wider Air Force?
It's not only happening across the Air Force, it's happening across the MOD. So the Army have got their own equivalent type trials that they're looking at. Catrick, for instance, just up the road, the A1 here, doing some really great work. The Navy are also looking at similar sort of stuff at HMS Collingwood. So we're all doing our own little thing in an overall context, and we're all sharing information because we're doing it slightly differently, and until we really understand what fits what type of building best, we're having that sort of, in the next few years, a bit of an experimentation, and then we'll figure out what is the best solution, whether it's a 1960s building or a 1970s building or we have buildings from 1917 at RAF Cranwell. So what's the best thing to do with those buildings, or ultimately do we just bulldoze the building? We'll want to keep some historical buildings, but where it makes sense, and the business case says, we'll actually just get rid of the building and replace it with something far more energy efficient. You'd
mentioned at the start as well that the targets for the infrastructure were a lot quicker than 2040. I think you said 2025. Are you working fast enough? Are you on course to make that target?
Well, so it's 2025 here at RAF Leeming, just because RAF Leeming is our living laboratory and our vanguard, because you have to really look at a whole base in a systems of systems way, because when you bring in the technology, and you've got to bring it in the right order. So it's no good decarbonising using heat pump technology, so air source or ground source heat pump, if your building is still leaking, and RAF Leeming is heating Northallerton just down the road because we use so much heat. So that's the reason why we're looking at things in a more of a systems of systems way. But in terms of RAF Leeming, we've set it up as a living laboratory. So that's what we call RAF Leeming is our living laboratory, and we also have a project called Project Vital, where we're just partnering with academia and some industry partners, and they will come in and bring different types of technology that we don't normally look at in a sort of quite a rapid research and development loop. So things like lightweight solar that we could maybe put on all the roofs. If you look at a typical RAF base or a military base, we have huge acreage of roof space that, why would we not want to put solar panels on them? The problem at the moment is the roofs are not designed to take the weight of a standard solar panel that you and I would see on our house. So if we can develop some lightweight solar systems to go on the roofs, that would be fantastic. And when we re-roof a hangar, or we re-roof a mess block, then why would we not want to turn that into an active roof and generate energy, geothermal energy as well under the ground? We've got lots of water boreholes here at RAF Leeming. They have heat in them, not a huge amount of heat, but if we can extract some of that heat, saves us then and preheat some water, that then saves energy getting up to the temperature that you actually need in the building.
You'd mentioned that gas is one of the biggest challenges on the MOD estate. There's a lot of buildings in every base you go to, whether that be RAF, Navy or Army. I'm aware that there's a couple of stations that are trying different sources of fuel, or they're trying to make their own fuel. Can you tell us a little bit about some of that?
Yep, so as gas is the biggest challenge that we have on a typical military base. So there are a number of ways of doing that. So RAF Marham and here as well, we're looking at using biogas. So we have a biogas plant fairly close to quite a few RAF stations. That has a smaller carbon footprint than natural gas that comes through the pipeline. So it would make sense to look at biogas initially. We're also looking at potentially hydrogen. So up here in the northeast, the gas network distributor is looking to transition back to hydrogen. We take our gas from them, so would it not make sense to look at whether RAF Leeming could run on a percentage of hydrogen, or ultimately maybe 100% hydrogen? That comes with a lot of challenges. The gas network has got to be hydrogen safe. The equipment that you use at the end of the pipeline has got to be hydrogen ready. People have got to be comfortable with hydrogen. So we're in those early discussions at the moment as to whether we can do hydrogen on the infrastructure trials here at Leeming, maybe starting with one building and then moving to a number of buildings on that gas spur, and then ultimately, could we actually turn the whole of RAF Leeming into a hydrogen town, if you like? So they're the sort of things we're thinking about, really in early discussions, but it links to other hydrogen trials we're doing here at Leeming with vehicles. So we've got an aircraft tug that we're converting to a hydrogen fuel cell, and that's one way of decarbonising some of our vehicle platforms. And then part of that project as well is looking at a typical diesel internal combustion engine, and can you convert that to a hydrogen internal combustion engine, for instance? Because we have tens of thousands of diesel vehicles and noisy aeroplanes. There you go, power of freedom. So as I was saying, we have tens of thousands of vehicles in the military fleet. We're not going to throw them away. We will replace them at some stage. But if we can get them to run a lot cleaner by using some form of hydrogen or potentially ammonia or whatever, then we should look at that really, because it also will then help maybe the whole of the UK economy, figure out how we drive around in diesel vehicles, and do we go electric or do we go hydrogen? So
there's also similar things going on at Marham and Bryce Norton, I think, isn't there, in terms of gas?
RAF Marham definitely gets a lot of its electricity from a biogas plant fairly close by. As I said, here at Leeming we have a biogas plant just the other side of the perimeter. So we're in early discussions to see how we can use biogas there. There are lots of experiments as to how you can generate your own biogas. If you have a sewage farm, for instance, that's potentially where you could generate your own biogas on a station. So everywhere you can generate your own energy, be it solar farms or geothermal or biogas, on a station, not only are you reducing your carbon footprint, you're also increasing your energy resilience on the station. So if there were to be a local power outage, then you have the capability of keep operating, because if the power goes out and people turn to the military to help out, if we have no power, we're part of the problem. Whereas if we got our own power and we almost can generate a small amount of power for our minimum sort of mission critical functions on a station, then that gives us an operational resilience that we haven't had in the past.
You touched on electric vehicles there briefly. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that. Been in Leeming a couple of days now, and I've been down to Marham recently, and everywhere you go you see there's the electric scooters. I'm aware that some of the cars around here are electric vehicles. Can you just tell us a bit about why they're here and the impact that they're having?
Yep, so there's two slightly different issues there. So the white fleet vehicles are the ones that you'd pick up from MT typically, or a little van that runs around the station. There is a government mandate, so we have to do it by law, to convert 25% of those vehicles to ultra low emission vehicles, which generally are battery at the moment or hybrid, by December 2022. And then 100% zero emission vehicles by December 2027. So here at Leeming we had some of the first electric vehicles that you can pick up and order when you want to use an MT vehicle, and that's going to change slightly, so that anything up to 3.5 tons will have to be zero emission by December 2027. On the e-scooter side, that's sort of part of the on-station travel plan, if you like a green travel plan, and these are just one of the technologies we're looking to trial to see whether it's suitable for an RAF station. Different stations have had different experiences. We've just done a survey to try and understand why we have different experiences, but through the Astra programme we're also now about to fund some e-bikes, some e-cargo type bikes, so that people can move small packages around, maybe some golf cart type, golf buggy type things. So it's all part of helping people move around the station without having to jump in their car. So one, you're saving fuel from your car, and secondly, it's sort of improving the air quality on the station and allowing people to move around without, with reducing their carbon footprint. So it's just one of those technologies that we decided to trial. If it works, then stations have that option to use e-scooters in the future, or e-bikes or whatever. We're not forcing people to use them, but only if it's something that the station personnel wish to use. And it makes sense for them to use them on the station. But we also need to look at like the legal issues of e-scooters on station roads. How do they interact with people coming onto the station from the private sector, etc. So it's all about the systems of systems thing. So you don't just bring a technology in because it looks like a sexy technology. You have to understand the context within which you bring in that technology. And e-scooters is just one of those contexts, And if you think about e-scooter trials that are happening in Middlesbrough just up the road, or London, Paris, they all have slightly different experiences which we're trying to learn from, to make sure that actually if we want to introduce it, it does make sense.
On the social media front, there was some negative comments that were spread quite widely about the electric scooter initiative, specifically at Marham. It's maybe not exactly the response that we wanted or were hoping for. Do you think a response like that is fair? And what is it that we're doing to communicate the reasons for having these and the RAF's achievements along the way?
I haven't specifically seen the responses from the Marham one, but you can expect negative response from anything you do, to be honest. And that's the reason why we've just done the survey. So we've had the survey back from RAF Leeming. We're just hoping to have the survey back from RAF Marham, and then we'll try and understand the sort of the positive and negatives, and then we'll adjust how we look at this technology as we move forward. But it's all part of helping the RAF move towards net zero in a little. Every little helps, if you like, and part of that is also looking at how we design the station. So when we are developing estate management plans or estate development plans, then some of the stations we're actually looking at where do we put the car parks? Where can we move the slam blocks close to where people work, so that they can either cycle or walk to work rather than having to drive from one part of the station to the other just to get to work. And so it's all part of that systems approach. Is if we can get people closer to where they living closer to where they work, that's great. If they have to move around the station using some sort of mechanical transport, then it makes absolute sense that it's in a sort of a zero emissions type fashion, be that an e-scooter or an e-bike or a golf cart or something, or even in the future, maybe we have autonomous, electric hydrogen transport crew buses just wandering around, and you almost like an Uber thing. You call it up and you move from one part of the station to another. We don't know. So, we're very open to look at different technologies, but they have to be compatible with the military way of operating.
The other thing I wanted to mention in terms of the pure fuel front, so in terms when we deploy on operations and exercises in the field, we quite heavily rely on diesel powered generators at the minute to generate electricity, and the mobile kitchens would use a lot of gas, etc. As part of the work you're doing, is there steps been taken to reduce carbon footprint of that sort of thing as we deploy?
Yeah, so everything we're doing on a static station at RAF Leeming, we're then asking a question, how could I do that when I deploy? So it's great at Leeming. We've got lots of land. We could put up, we can put quite a big solar farm up. We could get biogas from the other side of the fence, but I can't do that when I'm deploying. So every time we do something, as I said, we always ask the question, how do I do that when I'm deployed? And it may be that we have to use slightly different technology. So some of the approaches we're looking at when we test the technology on a station, if you can deliver that to me in an ISO container, we can then move it around the station, or we can move it between stations. It also means that I can potentially deploy it into a field exercise and then trial it in a typical field exercise. So we're now developing a plan to take, for instance, 34 Squadron RAF Regiment here at RAF Leeming and say, well, if we go and look at a typical deployment for them, how can I take them off fossil fuels in 5 or 6 years, or if I can't, how can I minimise their carbon footprint? And then we can build on that experience to maybe a bigger exercise and a bigger exercise that ultimately, we have to find a way in 20 or 30 years' time to deploy beyond fossil fuels, because that's where society, that's where climate change adaptation is taking us. So this is a long-term de-risking exercise, and every time we do something, we always have to ask the question, not only on a deployed estate side. So if I had a future Camp Bastion, how would I power a future Camp Bastion beyond fossil fuels, and how would I fuel the aircraft flying from a future Camp Bastion? And that's always the second question whenever we do anything here at RAF Leeming, is how do I do this? One, is it compatible for when I deploy? So a massive solar farm, not compatible. Lightweight solar, if I was to have a tent, a big tent or a deployed rub hanger or something that was covered in solar panels, that would be fantastic. So it's really looking at that dual static and deployed scenario that we always must take into account when we're looking at these technologies.
You mentioned earlier as well that there's some legal requirements around some of the targets that you have and the things you're doing. Is the reason for doing all of this because it's a legal requirement, or is there something more to it than that?
Well, part of it obviously is if you have a legal requirement, you've got to look at doing it. But as I said before, this is part of the long range de-risking of going beyond fossil fuels, and not only fossil fuels, but maybe some other critical resources that are becoming a bit of a challenge in the supply chain. And so it's always a good military thing to look at what are your risks and how do you adapt and minimise that risk. And therefore, that's why we're looking slightly faster than some of the legal requirements, because some of the technologies we're looking at actually do bring us a significant operational advantage. So if we have aircraft that are flying around that are a lot quieter, that's a really good thing from a military perspective. If we have aircraft that are not generating contrails, and you don't particularly want the enemy to see you in the sky, that's a really good advantage. And also if you've got equipment that's got a smaller thermal footprint and a smaller infrared signature, that's also a very good military advantage. So we're not only looking at the legal issues, we're always looking at, does this equal or enhance the military capability of what we're delivering? Because otherwise we have to question why we're doing it. And the third thing is we must always look at interoperability. So we never deploy on our own. So that's why we're now in discussions with lots of other air forces and NATO to say, what are you doing? Because we're doing this. So we're collaborating on exchanging information on synthetic aviation fuels, electric, hydrogen, etc. Because ultimately when we all deploy, we're very fortunate at the moment we can just exchange diesel or we can exchange aviation fuel. In the future I want to be able to do that with synthetic aviation fuel, or we can plug electric things together, or we can exchange the right quality of hydrogen. So from a military perspective and also from a global sort of aviation perspective, we always need to be able to drop into anywhere and pick up the fuel. So the other one is, does it equal or enhance operational capability? But does it allow me to be interoperable with our allies?
From what you know, would you say that we are behind our allies, or are we ahead of the game with our allies in terms of sustainability in the future of the aircraft?
I think in some areas we have moved ahead. Some of our allies were ahead of us, and for over a number of years they sort of stagnated, and then for whatever reason they didn't move forward. But it's not really a race as to who's best. It's a case of what suits each particular air force's needs to move forward, and that's why collaboration is always really good, because some are resource strapped, some are legally strapped in terms of wanting to go ahead faster than maybe they would wish to go. So we see this collaboration as helping the military aviation community all move forward together. And if we can help people move ahead slightly faster than maybe they could have done, then that's great. Other air forces might help us move faster in other areas where we haven't quite got the resources. So I would say it's not a race, but it's we are in at the leadership, at the vanguard of what's happening at the moment, and that's always a good thing. But again, we don't want to be moving too fast to then maybe pick the wrong technology. So there is that balance between moving fast, lagging behind, and sort of being on that leading edge to make sure that either we influence where we want to go, or we're sort of just maybe taking a bit of a step back to say, actually, is this where we want to go? And have a discussion with all our allies to say, if we go this way, is that a good thing for everybody?
So if I'm stationed up in Lossiemouth, or if I'm down in Marham or Bryce Norton, I'm doing my day-to-day job, why do I need to pay attention to this now? How does it affect me?
Well, there's a number of reasons really. One, it's a good thing to do, so we're not wasting money. So all the money that we waste on fuel and electricity is not going to something else that we desperately need in the military. So that's a good thing. Secondly, the more we can reduce the energy demand, the easier it will be able to get to net zero. So that's a good thing. Secondly, we need to train in peace as we would operate in war. So if we're very used to operating at RAF X when we're in a slam block or at work, then that's a really good thing to have as behaviours when you deploy, because obviously delivering fuel in a deployed environment is actually quite dangerous, putting people's lives at risk. So that's a really good thing. And secondly, it's really the attitude and the ethos we need for the next generation Air Force. This is what we expect everybody to take on board from the day they step through the recruiting office, get trained, and then out into the real world operating the RAF. It's all about energy efficiency, resource efficiency, and allowing us to move money from where we're wasting it to money where we actually require it. 40,000 people doing their little bit. As you say, everybody does their little bit, but 40,000 times a little bit is a lot. So if we all do our piece in whatever capacity we can, we need everybody to play their part. Then that will really, really help us to move to where we need to be in 2040.
So as we've been talking here, sir, you've shown that you're clearly very, very knowledgeable and enthusiastic about this. I get the sense that it goes way beyond this just being a 9-to-5 job for you. What is it that makes you so passionate about this whole subject?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I have been trying to do this for 20 years. So I saw this when I was OC Tactical Communications Wing, deploying to Iraq. Fuel was putting my people's lives at risk. We had great opportunities to become self-sufficient. So that was an operational reason for it. Secondly, when I'm not a reservist, I am a sustainability consultant, so it's part of my sort of normal business approach. But ultimately, it's looking at my children and my grandchildren. We've got ourselves into where we are now, and really it's for our generation to help set the right tone and set the right pathway for future generations, and it's just the right thing to do from me as a person. I do it in my private life, I do it in my non-RAF business life, and I'm very fortunate to have been asked to come back in again and lead the RAF Net Zero 40 challenge. So as you say, it's a core issue for me in everything I do.
Looking back at some news from the RAF, this is Reheat. I'm SAC Victoria Andrews. The RAF has had the honour of dismounting and mounting the Guard at Buckingham Palace, meaning the changing of the Guard was an entirely light blue affair. The parade marked the 80th anniversary of the RAF Regiment, who were represented on the Palace forecourt by the Queen's Colour Squadron and 10 other regular and reserve members who carried their squadron standards. Group Captain Sutton, Deputy to the Commandant General, RAF Regiment, made this address.
We pay tribute to all those who've served over those many years. Your courage and fighting spirit are inspirational. But even as we reflect on our past, our officers and gunners are today writing the next chapters of our story, serving with distinction across the world, deploying new technologies, and as ready as ever to fight on the ground to enable control of the air.
The full video can be viewed on the regiment's Twitter and Facebook channel. 300 personnel are in the US on exercise Red Flag. Typhoon and Voyager crews join combat and support aircraft from the US and Royal Australian Air Force, flying sorties over the Nevada Test and Training Range, an area the same size as half of Wales. The exercise offers unparalleled training and prepares aviators for operations against any adversary that may choose to confront the UK in the air, space and cyber domains. It also provides an important opportunity to reaffirm the RAF's close ties with the United States Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force. And finally to sport, where RAF football referee Corporal Lauren Impey has been promoted to officiate in the Women's Super League, the highest level of women's football in England. Her appointment follows impressive performances in 2001 at the UEFA International Tournament and the Women's FA Cup final. Her appointment follows impressive performances in 2001 at the UEFA International Tournament and the Women's FA Cup final. Corporal Impey has previously played for Leicester City and had a scholarship to play in America. That's Reheat on Inside Air.
I'm SAC Simon Ross with this episode's Name That Noise. That was the sound of a 4-man bobsled being pushed down an ice track. The largest ever contingent of military personnel are attending an Olympic Games this year, proving the future is not only bright, but also light blue. Regiment Gunner Lance Corporal Shanwayne Stevens qualified for the Jamaican bobsleigh team and is competing in the 4-man and 2-man sled races. He famously adapted his training program during lockdown, when he and his team pushed a car in order to practice. But now he carries the Cool Runnings legacy at Beijing, where Jamaica's bobsleigh team are making their first appearance in 24 years. Chief Technician Mark Silver is supporting the Jamaican bobsleigh team at the Games, and Chief Technician Stu Benson is coaching the Team GB bobsleigh team. The Beijing Winter Olympic Games began on the 4th of February 2022.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.